Well, good morning. Thank you very much for joining me on this video. I want to talk to you this morning about tenant issues, landlord and tenant issues. You know, the content of these videos comes from problems or situations that crop up and cross my desk on a regular basis, and probably more than any other, I get questions about tenancy issues. I want you to imagine that you are listing a property, your client calls you up, and the property is tenanted. Well, that creates some challenges. One of the challenges, obviously, is showing. The tenant doesn't want to be evicted. He doesn't want somebody to buy the property to move in, so he may not cooperate with showings. That's one of the problems. Your secondary problem is going to be making sure the tenant moves out. If the buyer wants it rather than as an investor, he wants to move in himself. So that's one challenge. Or it may be that you are a property manager and the landlord is having a problem with a tenant. And it may be that the tenant isn't paying the rent, and maybe the tenant is creating a disturbance with other tenants, and maybe the tenant is doing something illegal. There's a number of reasons why the landlord wants the tenant out, and he's relying on you as his agent to solve that problem and to get the tenant out. You've got to figure out how to do it. Well, the Residential Tenancy Board has come up with a number of, I'll call them N forms, that you can use, and you have to use the right form at the right time to get the process underway, either for an eviction order or to schedule a hearing. And for example, an N4, we're familiar with that probably, you use that for non-payment of rent. N5 is when a tenant is interfering with other tenants in the building, causing a problem, you need to get rid of them. And N6 for committing some kind of illegal acts, and so on. But the ones that we run across probably more so than any of the others is one is on N11, where the tenant voluntarily agrees to vacate, and so you have the landlord and tenant both sign an N11 where they say at the end of the tenancy, I vacate. Now sometimes the landlord's offering him some kind of monetary incentive to have that happen, but he signs it and you figure, I can breathe a sigh of relief, the tenant's promised to move. Or you use an N12, and you got to be careful about an N12. An N12 is what you would use because the buyer of the property wants to move in themselves. And there's provisions in the Act where it isn't just the landlord that can give the notice because he's moving in. He can give the notice on behalf of a beneficial owner, somebody who's buying the property, and if that party who's buying the property, either he or his eligible immediate family need to move into the property, you can give the tenant the notice to move out, and that would be an N12. And then, of course, there's an N13 where the landlord is going to do extensive renovations. He's going to change the use of the property, or he's going to demolish the property, and the tenant just has to vacate. So you give the right notice to the tenant, and you say that takes care of things, everything's fine. Here's the problem. If you've got a buyer and a seller, they can each agree to certain activities they're going to do. The buyer is going to fulfill certain conditions. The buyer is going to provide a deposit. The seller is going to do certain things. And they enter into a contract and they each spell out what they're going to do. And because they have control over themselves, you don't have to worry too much about it. But when they start promising what a third party is going to do, you can run into a snag, because you can never guarantee the third party is going to do what they have to do or what they agree to do. So on our agreement of purchase and sale, we put in there that the buyer requests and the seller agrees to provide the prerequisite notice requiring the tenant to vacate on behalf of the buyer who needs the property for his own use. But you need to add in there, however, the seller does not warrant that the tenant will in fact vacate. And then you need to say, and in the event the tenant does not vacate, the buyer agrees to close the transaction, assume the tenant, and take over the eviction process himself. Now, why do you do that? Because in the agreement of purchase and sale, the seller is promising vacant possession, and he can't guarantee that. So we have always a problem when there's a tenant in the property that the tenant might not do what he's supposed to do, either on order because it's needed for the buyer's use, or by mutual consent because they both signed an N11. So you come to closing and you find out the tenant's still there. Well, you say, well, they can't be. They either were told they had to move and were given the notice, or they agreed to move and now they're still here. Yeah, but you've got that problem, and now you're going to have to go to the board and you're going to have to either get an eviction order or you're going to have to schedule a hearing. And just the process takes months. So you've come to closing, and it may be 3 or 4 months before the eviction order is issued or before the hearing is scheduled. Well, there's something, and you may not be aware of this, but you need to be aware of this. There's something you can do in this process to speed it up, and it's the use of an L form. And I specifically want to talk about an L2 and an L3. An L2, for anything except for non-payment of rent, you can issue an L2 to order a hearing. And where a tenant has voluntarily agreed and signed an N11, you can issue an L3. And the L3 will give you an eviction order. So here's the thing. The magic of it is that the L2 or the L3, you don't have to wait until closing or until the deadline to find out whether the tenant's moved. You're allowed to file the L2 or the L3 anytime after the tenant has been given notice and up to and including 30 days after the scheduled time the tenant was supposed to leave. So what that means is, let's say, for example, the tenant voluntarily signs an N11 agreeing to vacate. You can then do it online. You can go online and you can file an L3, and you can get, and I would say within a couple of weeks, you can get an eviction order. Now, you've got it a month and a half before the tenant's required to move. There's a fee. Fee's about a couple $100, $220 I think. And you say, well, what happens if the tenant moved out? It's wasted money. Think of it as insurance. You know now, you can breathe a sigh of relief. If the tenant doesn't move out, and you've got an eviction order, you can go down to the sheriff, get it enacted, and get the locks changed and the tenant's out. Or if you use an L2 for other reasons, like the buyer needs it for his own use, then you can get a scheduled hearing, and the hearing's already scheduled before the deadline. If the tenant doesn't move out, you don't have that long delay to get to the hearing and make things happen. So it really helps shorten the process using the L forms, and specifically the L2, L3. Make sure you use the right form, do it online, and you'll really be giving your seller a beneficial service by doing so. Hope that makes sense. I want to thank you very much for joining me in this video. I'll talk to you again next week.